It happened on a muggy July evening in rural Alabama, a night where the air was heavy enough to drown in. The weatherman had predicted thunderstorms, but out in the sticks, we didn't need forecasts to know what was coming. The scent of rain clung to the wind, the sky smoldered a bruised purple, and the cicadas went quiet. That kind of silence, it's never a good sign. I was house-sitting for my aunt, who lived in an old plantation-style home on the edge of a pine forest. She had left to visit my cousin in Texas, leaving me to look after her dog, Samson, and her dozen or so chickens. The house itself always felt alive, with its groaning floorboards, whispering walls, and faint scent of old wood. I never liked staying there, but the money was good, and I figured I'd get some peace and quiet. The storm hit just after dusk. Samson, a massive German shepherd with a bark that could rattle windows, had curled into a quivering ball at my feet. Lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating the skeletal trees outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself when the power cut out. I sighed, fishing around for the flashlight I'd left on the counter. Samson whined as the darkness swallowed us, and I gave his head a reassuring pat. "It's just a storm, buddy," I muttered. But even as I said it, I felt it, that prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as nerves and went about lighting the oil lamps my aunt kept for just such occasions. Their warm glow pushed back the shadows, but it didn't do much for the unease gnawing at my gut. The storm seemed to intensify, each crack of thunder louder than the last. Then I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. I froze. Who the hell would be out in a storm like this? I waited, holding my breath, but the knocks came again. This time, slower, deliberate. Samson growled low in his throat, his hackles rising as he stared at the door. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. At first I saw nothing but darkness, rain streaking the glass. Then, another flash of lightning lit up the porch, and my blood turned to ice. There was a man standing there, soaked to the bone, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide and staring, unblinking, and his mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't reach them. He raised a hand and knocked again, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just that eerie grin. I backed away from the door, grabbing the baseball bat I'd left by the umbrella stand. Samson was growling louder now, his teeth bared. Then, the man did something that made my stomach churn. He pressed his face against the glass, smearing rainwater and something dark I didn't want to think about. His grin widened, his teeth yellow and uneven. I bolted the door, my hands shaking, and backed into the living room. My mind raced. Should I call the cops? But the landline was dead, and cell service out here was spotty at best. I decided to wait it out, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. The knocking continued, rhythmic and relentless. I sat on the couch, gripping the bat, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the storm. Then I heard a new sound. A scratching, like nails on glass, coming from the kitchen window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The window was partially fogged from the humidity, but through the haze I saw him again. That same man, his grin fixed in place, his eyes locked on me. He raised a hand and tapped on the glass, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Let me in," he said, his voice muffled but chillingly clear. "It's cold out here." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Samson, who was barking furiously now. The man's grin faltered for a moment, replaced by something far worse. Rage. His hand slammed against the glass, and I heard the faintest crack. Panicking, I ran upstairs, dragging Samson with me. I locked us in the master bedroom, barricading the door with a dresser. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I sat in the dark, straining to hear over the storm, but all was quiet. Too quiet. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the bat, my eyes darting to every shadow. Samson whined softly, pressing against my leg. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a floorboard groaning under weight. He was inside. I bit back a scream, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles ached. The sound grew louder, deliberate footsteps climbing the stairs. My mind raced. How had he gotten in? All the doors and windows were locked. "Go away," I screamed, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Silence, except for the storm raging outside. Then the door handle jiggled. "Let me in," the voice whispered, just on the other side of the door. It was the same voice, but now it was wrong, distorted, like multiple people speaking at once. I pressed my back against the wall, like holding the bat up like it would actually do anything against whatever this was. Samson growled low, his ears flat against his head. The handle stopped moving, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then, the knocking started again. Not on the door this time, but on the window behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The bedroom window was on the second floor. There was no porch roof, no tree, nothing for anyone to stand on. But there he was, grinning at me through the glass, his head tilted at that impossible angle. "You can't keep me out," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. I screamed, hurling the bat at the window. It shattered, and the man vanished. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain pouring through the broken glass. Then the footsteps started again, running down the hallway, faster this time. I grabbed Samson and bolted, racing down the stairs and out the back door into the storm. I didn't care about the rain or the mud sucking at my shoes. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, half a mile down the road. When I told them what had happened, they gave me a strange look. "You mean the old Garrett house?" the husband said, his face pale. "No one's lived there for years." I shook my head, trying to explain that my aunt lived there, but they just exchanged uneasy glances. The wife finally said, "The Garretts were killed in that house during a storm just like tonight. They say the man of the house went mad and, well, you're lucky to be alive." I never went back to my aunt's house. She moved out not long after, claiming she felt a dark presence there. I didn't argue. Sometimes, though, I still hear that knocking in my dreams, and every time it rains, I can't help but feel like he's still out there, waiting.
Story number 2.
It was the kind of storm you felt in your bones, the kind that seemed alive. The summer heat had brooded all day, and by midnight, it had arrived in full fury. Thunder cracking like a whip, lightning painting skeletal trees against the sky, and sheets of rain hammering the earth. I was driving back from a late shift at the diner, the back roads slick with water and treacherous curves. My little sedan's headlights barely pierced the blackness, and the windshield wipers were working overtime. I hated driving in storms. It wasn't just the danger of the roads, it was something more primal, like the night had secrets it didn't want you to see. And that night, I saw something I wish I hadn't. The road took me past an old church that sat abandoned, half swallowed by the surrounding woods. The building was a relic of the 1800s, with peeling white paint, a leaning bell tower, and shattered stained glass windows. Locals called it the Hollow Chapel, and it had a reputation, one I didn't put much stock in until that night. As I rounded the bend, my headlights caught movement near the church. A woman stood by the roadside, her long hair plastered to her face by the rain. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a thin white nightgown, soaked and clinging to her skin. She raised a hand, flagging me down. My first thought was that she needed help. No one would be out in this storm willingly, and the nearest house was miles away. I slowed the car and rolled down the window just enough to hear her. "Are you okay?" I called, struggling to make myself heard over the storm. She stepped closer, her pale face illuminated by the car's interior light. Her eyes were hollow, shadowed in a way that made my stomach twist. Her lips barely moved as she said, "They're coming." "What? Who's coming?" I asked, glancing nervously at the dark woods around us. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her arm and pointed toward the church. Lightning illuminated the building, and for a split second, I thought I saw figures moving behind the broken windows. Dark, hunched shapes that didn't move like people. My skin prickled with cold fear. "Get in the car," I said, unlocking the passenger door. The woman hesitated, glancing back at the church before finally slipping into the seat. She was shivering, her hands clutching at her knees. I started driving, but the road ahead felt longer than it should have, like the car wasn't making any progress. I glanced at the woman, who was staring straight ahead, her wet hair obscuring part of her face. "Where do you need to go?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "They're already here," she whispered. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Who's here?" I demanded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She turned to face me, and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes weren't just shadowed, they were empty. Dark voids that seemed to pull the light out of the car. Her lips curled into a chilling smile as she said, "You shouldn't have stopped." The car jolted violently, like I'd hit something, and I slammed on the brakes. The woman was gone. The passenger seat was soaked, but there was no sign of her. My heart pounded as I looked around, but the road was empty, the woods silent except for the rain. I took a deep breath, convincing myself I'd imagined it, and started driving again. That's when I noticed the church ahead of me. Again. It didn't make sense. I had been driving away from it. But there it was, its leaning bell tower barely visible through the sheets of rain. The car's engine sputtered, the headlights flickering, and I cursed under my breath. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, though I hadn't turned it on. A static-filled voice whispered, "You can't leave." Panic surged through me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but the car didn't move. The engine roared uselessly as if the wheels were spinning on air. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, figures emerging from the woods. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. I locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel like it could somehow protect me. The figures surrounded the car, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. One of them stepped closer, pressing a pale, skeletal hand against the window. The woman's voice whispered in my ear, though she was nowhere to be seen. "They've claimed this place, and now they'll claim you." The figure's hand began to push against the glass, and cracks spiderwebbed across it. I screamed, fumbling for the gear shift and slammed the car into reverse. The engine roared, and this time the tires caught. I sped backward, the figures melting into the storm. The car lurched as I hit something, but I didn't stop. I turned the wheel sharply, spinning the car around, and sped down the road as fast as the slick conditions would allow. The church disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment, miles away in town. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my keys and stumbled inside. I locked every door and window, turned on every light, and sat on the couch with my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was over, that I'd escaped whatever had happened. But the next morning, when I went to the car, my blood ran cold. The passenger seat was still damp, and there was something scratched into the dashboard. 4 words, "You can't leave us." That night, I heard the knocking. It started softly, a gentle tap on my bedroom window, but I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't dare look. I never drove that road again, and I moved out of the apartment within a month. But sometimes on stormy nights, I still hear the knocking, and I see those shadowy figures in my dreams. And when I wake, the words on the dashboard echo in my mind. "You can't leave us."
Story number 3.
When I was 15, my family moved to a remote farmhouse in Kansas. It was a fixer-upper, the kind of place where every floorboard groaned and every breeze found a crack to whistle through. My parents had dreams of turning it into a charming country home. I hated it from the start. The house felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath. From the moment we stepped inside, I noticed little things. The way the air seemed colder in certain rooms, the faint smell of dirt and decay no matter how much we cleaned, and the feeling of being watched. But I chalked it up to my own paranoia. Then the storms started. In Kansas, storms are a way of life, but these were different, violent. Each one seemed to zero in on our little house, battering it with howling winds and sheets of rain so heavy you couldn't see past the windows. The power went out every time, leaving us with only candles and oil lamps to fight the darkness. It was during one of these storms that I first saw her. I had gone to bed early, trying to escape the tension that always seemed to rise when the lights went out. My room was at the end of the hall, with a single window that overlooked the overgrown field behind the house. That night, the wind howled so loudly it sounded like a scream, and lightning lit up the sky every few seconds. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the storm. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I froze. It wasn't a branch or the wind. It was deliberate, like someone knocking to be let in. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I peeked out from under the covers. A bolt of lightning lit up the room, and I saw her. A girl, no older than me, standing outside the window. Her hair was matted to her face from the rain, and her dress was old-fashioned, like something out of a history book. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and pleading, and she mouthed a single word, "Help!" I screamed, diving back under the covers. My parents came rushing in, but when I pointed to the window, there was nothing there, just rain streaking the glass and the occasional flicker of lightning. My dad dismissed it as my imagination, and my mom promised to check on me in the morning. But I knew what I'd seen. Over the next few weeks, the girl appeared again and again, always during storms, always outside my window. Sometimes she would knock, her pale hand pressed against the glass. Other times she would simply stand there, staring at me with those wide, desperate eyes. I tried to ignore her, to pretend she wasn't real, but it was impossible. She was as real as the storm itself. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The storm was raging, the power was out, and the girl was there again, her face so close to the window that her breath fogged the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed downstairs, determined to confront her. I threw open the back door, the wind nearly tearing it from my hands, and shone the flashlight into the field. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. She was gone. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The beam of my flashlight caught a figure in the distance, running toward the woods at the edge of the property. Against every instinct, I followed. The mud sucked at my boots as I ran, rain blinding me and lightning guiding my path. I called out for her, but she didn't turn around. She disappeared into the trees, and I hesitated for only a moment before plunging in after her. The woods were darker than I expected, the storm barely penetrating the thick canopy. I shone the flashlight around, calling out for the girl, but there was no sign of her, just the rustling of branches and the relentless drumming of the rain. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. In the center was a crumbling stone well overgrown with moss and ivy. The girl was standing beside it, her back to me. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" She turned slowly, her wet hair clinging to her face. Up close, I could see how gaunt she was, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. She pointed to the well and whispered, "They're down there." I shook my head, stepping back. "What are you talking about? Who's down there?" Before she could answer, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled forward, falling to my knees. The girl was gone, but her voice echoed all around me, a whisper carried on the wind. "Help them." I peered into the well, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but damp stone walls. Then, something moved. A hand. It shot up from the darkness, skeletal and clawing at the edge of the well. I screamed, scrambling backward as more hands emerged, followed by faces, hollow-eyed and grinning, their mouths twisted into silent screams. They were climbing out. I ran, tripping over roots and branches as I fled back to the house. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside with the door bolted behind me. My parents found me huddled in the corner, soaked and shaking. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? The next day, I went back to the woods in the safety of daylight. The clearing was still there, but the well was gone. In its place was a patch of scorched earth, as if it had been burned long ago. I never saw the girl again, but the storms never stopped. Each one felt more violent than the last, as if the house itself were angry. When we finally moved away 2 years later, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in ages. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the wind starts to howl, I think of that girl and the well and the hands clawing their way out. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or are they still waiting for me to come back?
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains, far from the city, far from anyone. Just the 6 of us, a few cases of beer, and the promise of a weekend without Wi-Fi or responsibilities. It sounded perfect, until it wasn't. The first night started off great. We grilled burgers, laughed around the fire, and told ghost stories that felt ridiculous in the safety of the cabin's warm glow. But as the night wore on, the storm rolled in. It started with distant thunder, barely audible over our chatter. Then came the lightning, lighting up the forest in stark, fleeting flashes. By the time the rain started, we'd retreated indoors. The cabin was cozy, but old, with creaking wooden floors and a single oil lamp that flickered when the power cut out. We joked about how it added to the rustic experience as we played cards by candlelight. The storm raged outside, shaking the cabin to its core. That's when we heard it, a knock at the front door. We froze. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one knew we were here. Who could possibly be out there in the middle of a storm? Probably just a branch hitting the door, Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Against our better judgment, we decided to check it out. Mike grabbed the flashlight, and we all followed him to the door. He hesitated before opening it, his hand hovering over the knob. "Hello?" he called out. No response. Finally, he opened the door. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing. There was no one there. "See? Nothing to worry about," Mike said, shutting the door and locking it. We laughed nervously, pretending it wasn't a big deal, but the unease settled in like a fog. An hour later, the knocking started again, this time on the window. "Okay, that's not the wind," Sarah said, her voice shaking. We shined the flashlight toward the window, but saw nothing. just rain streaking the glass and the reflection of our pale faces. We tried to brush it off, but the knocking didn't stop. It moved from one window to another, then to the walls, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. Maybe it's an animal, Jess suggested, though we all knew no animal would knock like that. Mike and I decided to check it out. Armed with the flashlight and a rusted fire poker we'd found by the hearth, we stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked us instantly, and the cold cut through our clothes. We circled the cabin, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. See? Just our image. Mike's words died in his throat as the beam of light fell on something. Footprints. Bare footprints in the mud, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. They were too small to be an adult's, but there was something off about them. The toes were too long, the prints too deep, as if whatever had made them was impossibly heavy. "Let's go back inside," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We locked every door and window, dragging furniture in front of the entrances like it would make a difference. The knocking stopped, but the storm seemed to grow louder, angrier. The wind screamed through the trees and the rain hit the roof like nails. Then we heard it, a child's laughter. It came from the woods, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. We all heard it, though none of us wanted to admit it. "It's just the storm," Jess said, her face pale. "Wind can sound like anything." But deep down, we knew better. The laughter grew louder, closer. Then it stopped, replaced by a new sound. Scratching. It came from the roof, slow and deliberate, that like nails dragging across wood. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. No one answered. The scratching moved, crawling across the ceiling like whatever was up there was circling us. Mike grabbed the fire poker, and we all stood frozen, our eyes fixed on the ceiling. Suddenly there was a loud thud, as if something heavy had jumped down onto the porch. The doorknob rattled violently, and the door shuddered under the force of something trying to get in. "Who's out there?" Mike shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The laughter returned, louder now and closer. It was coming from just outside the door. "Let's get out of here," I said, grabbing my keys. We bolted for the car, not caring about the storm. The wind whipped at us, and the laughter followed, echoing through the trees. We piled into the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the tires skidding on the muddy driveway as we sped away. The laughter faded as we put distance between ourselves and the cabin, but the feeling of being watched didn't. No one spoke. We just sat there, drenched and trembling, as I drove us back to town. The next day, we called the rental company to report what had happened. The man on the phone listened quietly before asking, "Did you see them?" "See who?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "The children," he said, his voice low. "They've been there for years. No one knows where they came from, but they knock on the doors and scratch at the walls. If you hear them laugh, it's already too late." I hung up, my hands shaking. We never went back to the cabin, but sometimes on stormy nights, I hear that laughter in my dreams, and when I wake, I swear I can still hear faint scratching on the walls.
Story number 5.
I grew up in the Midwest, where storms roll in like clockwork in the spring. As a kid, I always found the sound of rain comforting. It was like nature's lullaby. But that changed one summer night when I was 17, a night I've spent years trying to forget. Our house sat on the edge of a small, unremarkable town, surrounded by flat fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. There wasn't much to do, especially during storms, so I spent most evenings holed up in my room, listening to music or texting friends. That night, the storm arrived suddenly, a wall of black clouds swallowing the sky just after sunset. The rain started in a torrential downpour, and the wind screamed like a living thing. The power went out around 9 p.m., plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way downstairs to find my dad setting up candles while my mom fumbled with the old radio. My younger sister Abby was curled up on the couch, her wide eyes darting toward the windows every time lightning illuminated the room. "Think it'll pass soon?" I asked, though the howling wind and shaking windows suggested otherwise. Dad shrugged. Storms like this usually blow over by morning. But something about this storm felt different. It wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was the silence in between, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed against my chest like a weight. Around midnight, I decided to head back upstairs to my room. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just branches against the house, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. "Do you hear that?" I called down to my parents. "What?" my mom asked, lighting another candle. Nothing, I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. In my room, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from my window. I froze, my hand hovering over the flashlight. The storm was too fierce for anyone to be outside. Still, I couldn't ignore the sound. Summoning my courage, I crept toward the window and pulled back the curtain. For a split second, lightning lit up the yard, and I saw her. A woman stood just beyond the edge of the porch, drenched and shivering. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, and she wore a thin, tattered dress that looked completely out of place for this weather, or this century. She raised a hand and pointed at me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. When I looked again, she was gone. Just the rain lashing against the glass. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow distorted by the storm. But deep down, I knew better. I locked my door and crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a child. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless, filled with strange, fragmented dreams of drowning in darkness. I woke sometime after 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and heavy, dragging slightly, as if whoever or whatever was out there was injured. My parents' room was at the other end of the hall, and Abby's door was right next to mine. I told myself it was Dad checking on us, but the footsteps didn't sound like his. They stopped right outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. The knob rattled, and I thought I might pass out from fear. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. Just a low, raspy sound, like someone breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and darted out of bed, throwing open the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt colder, almost damp, like the storm had seeped into the house. I checked Abby's room, but she was fast asleep, curled up with her favorite stuffed animal. I went downstairs to find my parents. They were still in the living room, Dad asleep in his chair and Mom reading by candlelight. "Did either of you just come upstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom frowned. "No, why?" "Never mind," I said quickly, not wanting to sound crazy. I didn't go back to my room that night. Instead, I sat on the couch staring at the flickering candlelight and listening to the relentless storm. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the world eerily quiet. The power was still out, so we decided to spend the day cleaning up branches and debris in the yard. While raking near the edge of the property, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Bare footprints in the mud, leading from the road to the house and stopping just beneath my bedroom window. "Must have been a drifter looking for shelter," Dad said when I showed him. He didn't seem too concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too still. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't just at my window. It came from all around the house, tapping at the windows, the walls, the doors. It was maddening, like 1,000 tiny hands clawing to get in. I woke my parents, and we searched the house together. Nothing. But as we were about to head back to bed, we heard it, soft, muffled sobbing coming from the basement. Dad grabbed a flashlight, and we all followed him downstairs. The sound grew louder as we descended, echoing off the damp stone walls. It was coming from the far corner, where an old wooden door led to the storm cellar. "Stay here," Dad said, motioning for us to wait. He opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking like a scream. The sobbing stopped. Dad shone the flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just a dirt floor and cobwebbed beams. We never figured out where the sound came from, but after that night, the house felt different. Shadows seemed darker, corners colder. The tapping didn't stop either. It continued for weeks, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it sounded like the house was under siege. Then, one night, it all stopped. The silence was almost worse. We moved out the following spring, but I've never forgotten that storm or the woman I saw outside my window. Sometimes on rainy nights, I swear I hear tapping on the glass, soft and deliberate, like a reminder that she's still out there waiting.
Story number 6.
When I was a kid, my family lived in a small, quiet town in the heart of Pennsylvania. Our house was an old Victorian with creaky stairs, drafty windows, and a basement that I avoided at all costs. But the most unsettling thing about the house was the attic. The attic door was in the hallway upstairs, just outside my bedroom. It wasn't like a normal door. It had a pull-down ladder, the kind you'd see in movies about haunted houses. My parents kept it locked, saying there was nothing up there but insulation and dust. But every so often, I'd hear noises coming from above, scratching, shuffling, faint whispers that sent shivers down my spine. My parents said it was just raccoons or birds. I wanted to believe them. One summer when I was about 12, my parents decided to take a weekend trip to visit some friends out of town. I didn't want to go, so they let me stay home with my older brother, Josh. He was 17, too cool to hang out with me, and spent most of his time in the garage tinkering with his car. The first night they were gone, a thunderstorm rolled in. I remember sitting in the living room trying to focus on the TV as lightning lit up the windows and thunder rattled the walls. Josh was in the garage, the distant hum of his music barely audible over the storm. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the attic door. My heart stopped. I muted the TV and listened, straining to hear over the pounding rain. The sound came again, louder this time, like the ladder was being pulled down. "Josh?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way upstairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. The attic door was still closed, but I could see the latch hanging loose, swinging slightly as if it had just been unlocked. "Josh, this isn't funny," I said, louder this time. The house was silent except for the storm. I reached for the latch, my hand shaking, and pulled it down. The ladder unfolded with a groan, revealing a yawning black hole above me. The air was colder up there, and it smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. "Hello?" I called, shining the flashlight into the attic. The beam swept over boxes, cobwebs, and dust-covered furniture. Nothing moved. I told myself it must have been the wind, though I didn't entirely believe it. I pushed the ladder back up, secured the latch, and hurried back downstairs. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Footsteps. Not the soft patter of animals, but deliberate, heavy steps pacing back and forth directly above my bedroom. I ran to the garage, my heart pounding in my chest. "Josh, there's someone in the attic," I shouted. He rolled his eyes. "It's probably squirrels, or maybe your imagination. I'm not making it up," I insisted, grabbing his arm. With a sigh, he followed me back into the house. The footsteps had stopped by the time we got upstairs, but Josh pulled down the ladder and climbed up anyway, grumbling about how I was wasting his time. He shined his flashlight around the attic, muttering under his breath. "See? Nothing here," he said, disappearing back down the ladder. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. When morning came, I convinced myself it was all in my head. The second night was worse. The storm returned, fiercer this time. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows. I tried to distract myself with a book, but around midnight, the attic noises started again. It was louder this time. Not just footsteps, but dragging sounds like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, almost too quiet to hear, but they grew louder, clearer, until I could make out words. They were coming from the air vent in my ceiling, directly below the attic. "Come up! Come up! Come up!" I screamed, bolting out of my room and down the hall to Josh's room. I shook him awake, babbling incoherently about the whispers. He groggily followed me back to the hallway, muttering about how I was going to owe him for this. The attic door was open. Josh frowned. "I locked this," he said, pulling down the ladder. "Stay here." I watched as he climbed up into the attic, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the storm. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard Josh scream. I froze, paralyzed by fear. His scream was followed by a thud, then the sound of the ladder slamming shut. The attic door snapped back into place with a force that shook the walls. "Josh?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do. Finally, I grabbed the flashlight and a baseball bat from Josh's room and climbed up the ladder. The attic was pitch black, the air thick and heavy. "Josh?" I called out, sweeping the flashlight around. The beam landed on something in the far corner. It wasn't Josh. A figure stood there, hunched and unnatural, its back to me. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its head twitched as if it were trying to turn around but couldn't quite manage it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing took a step toward me, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. I scrambled backward, my flashlight dropping from my hand. I half fell, half jumped down the ladder, landing hard on the hallway floor. The attic door slammed shut above me. the latch clicking into place. I ran to the garage and found Josh there, sitting on the floor, pale and shaking. He wouldn't tell me what he'd seen, but his hands were trembling so badly he couldn't hold the wrench he was clutching. We spent the rest of the night in the car, parked in the driveway with the doors locked and the engine running. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them everything. They didn't believe us, of course. A month later, we moved out of that house. My parents said it was because Dad got a new job, but I think they knew something was wrong. They just didn't want to admit it. I still think about that attic sometimes, especially during storms. I wonder what was up there at night, what Josh saw that made him scream. He never talks about it, and I've learned not to ask. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. Come up, come up.
Story number 7.
It was a Friday night, and I was house-sitting for my aunt while she and her family went on a weekend getaway. Her house was in a quiet, wooded neighborhood, far enough from the city that the silence could feel oppressive, the kind of place where the sound of a snapping twig could send your heart racing. I wasn't thrilled about spending 2 nights alone, but the money she offered was too good to pass up. Plus, I thought it might be nice to relax in a big, cozy house with a stocked fridge and no responsibilities. The first night started out uneventful. I watched a few movies, snacked on chips, and played with my aunt's golden retriever, Max. The storm that had been in the forecast rolled in around 9 p.m., bringing thunder that rumbled through the house and flashes of lightning that lit up the surrounding trees. Max didn't like the storm. He kept pacing, his ears pinned back and his tail low. Every now and then he'd stop, growl at nothing, and stare at the front door. "It's just the storm, buddy," I told him, scratching behind his ears. He didn't seem convinced. By 11 p.m., the storm had worsened. The rain hammered against the windows and the power flickered before going out entirely. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and lit a few candles, feeling a twinge of unease as the house plunged into semi-darkness. The storm's roar made it hard to hear anything else, but Max's growling drew my attention again. This time, he was staring at the back patio door, his body rigid, hackles raised. I shined the flashlight toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the glass fogged slightly by the humidity. I turned on the porch light to be sure. The bulb flickered for a moment before illuminating an empty deck, slick with rain. "See? Nothing out there," I said, though my voice wavered. Max didn't relax. He stayed by the door, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. A little after midnight, I decided to go to bed. The guest room was cozy enough, but the howling wind and Max's occasional growls made it hard to settle. I finally drifted off, only to be woken a couple of hours later by the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs, Max following close behind me. The scratching stopped as I reached the bottom step. The house was eerily silent, except for the storm raging outside. I shined the flashlight around the living room, the beam catching the reflection of the patio door. My breath hitched. The glass was smeared with handprints, dozens of them. They weren't there earlier. They were small, too small to be an adult's, and the streaks they left behind looked like something had been clawing at the door. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Max barked, his body tense as he faced the door. I moved closer, heart pounding, and looked out into the yard. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a figure darting between the trunks, but a flash of lightning revealed nothing but shadows. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and spent the rest of the night on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The next day, I called my aunt to ask if she'd ever noticed anything strange about the house. She laughed it off, saying the neighborhood was as safe as they come and that I was probably just spooked by the storm. I wanted to believe her. That night, the storm returned, stronger than before. The power was still out, and the air inside the house felt heavier, almost stifling. I stayed downstairs, watching Max pace nervously. Around midnight, the scratching started again, but this time it wasn't just at the patio door. It came from the windows, the walls, even the front door. I froze, listening as the sound moved around the house. Max growled, his eyes darting from one direction to another. "Who's there?" I shouted, fear making my voice crack. The scratching stopped. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, like someone was pounding on the front door with both fists. I grabbed Max's leash, intending to run out the back and make a break for the neighbor's house. But when I opened the patio door, I stopped cold. They were standing in the yard. 3 figures, small and hunched, their faces obscured by the rain and shadows. I couldn't tell if they were children or something else entirely, but their movements were unnatural, jerky, like marionettes with tangled strings. One of them tilted its head, and I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the storm. "Let us in." I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the key. The pounding on the front door resumed, louder and more violent, shaking the frame. Max barked furiously, his teeth bared, but when the pounding stopped, he whimpered and backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. "Let us in," the voice came again, this time from the living room window. I didn't respond. I didn't move. The next thing I knew, the attic door creaked open. The sound was so out of place, so wrong, that for a moment I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard footsteps, light, deliberate steps moving slowly down the attic stairs. I bolted for the garage, dragging Max with me. We locked ourselves inside the car, and I kept the keys in the ignition, ready to peel out the moment I saw anything. The house went silent. No pounding, no scratching, no whispers. Just the storm. When morning finally came, I ventured back inside. The house was empty, but the living room was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, the walls were scratched to ribbons, and the patio door was wide open. My aunt's neighbors said they didn't hear or see anything that night, but the look on their faces told me they were lying. I never house sat for her again. To this day, whenever it storms, I think about that night. And sometimes when the rain is heavy enough, I swear I hear faint knocking on my windows, accompanied by the same soft plea, "Let us in."
Story number 8.
When I was a teenager, my family moved to a small town in New Hampshire. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and gossip spread faster than wildfire. Our new house was an old colonial that sat on the edge of the woods. The locals called the area Black Hollow because the trees grew so thick that even on sunny days the woods were dark and uninviting. The house itself had its quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows. But what really unnerved me was the cellar. It wasn't a finished basement, just a cold, damp hole carved out of the earth. The walls were rough stone, and the air always smelled of mildew and dirt. My parents said it was just for storage, but even they didn't go down there often. A month after we moved in, strange things started happening. It began with noises, scratching sounds at night, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. My dad blamed mice. My mom said it was just the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't heavy, more like soft padding, as if someone barefoot was walking up and down the hallway outside my room. I got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped and the house was silent again. I chalked it up to a bad dream and went back to bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I mentioned it to my mom. She gave me a distracted smile and said, "Probably just the wind." That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by a faint, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like it was coming from below, deep in the house. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The thumping was coming from the cellar. I stood at the top of the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The wooden door to the cellar was slightly ajar, and the sound echoed up the narrow stairwell. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like a heartbeat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The noise stopped. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then the door creaked open wider, as if inviting me down. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to bed or woken my parents, or even run out of the house. But something compelled me to keep going. I descended the stairs slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of earth and rot made me gag. At the bottom of the stairs, I froze. In the center of the cellar floor, there was a large, circular hole. It hadn't been there before. The dirt around it was fresh, as if it had been dug recently, and it was so deep I couldn't see the bottom. I approached the edge, shining my flashlight into the pit. The beam didn't reach the bottom. Instead, it was swallowed by darkness. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and raspy, coming from the hole. "Help me," it said. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I stood there, paralyzed, as a hand, pale and skeletal, reached up from the darkness. It clawed at the edge of the hole, its nails caked with dirt. Then another hand appeared, followed by a head. The thing that emerged wasn't human. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to absorb all the light. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Help me," it said again, but the words sounded wrong, like they were being forced out of a throat that wasn't meant to speak. I dropped the flashlight and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My parents found me in the kitchen, shaking and pale. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but they didn't believe me. My dad even went down to the cellar to prove it was empty. The hole was gone. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The noises in the house got worse. Whispers, footsteps, scratching that sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Max, our dog, refused to go near the cellar. One night, I woke up to find him growling at my bedroom door, his fur standing on end. Then I started seeing things. Shadows that moved on their own, fleeting glimpses of figures standing at the edge of the woods, and always at night, the sound of digging. One evening, my mom found a dirt trail leading from the cellar to the back door. She thought it was an animal, but I knew better. Something was trying to get out. The final straw came a month later. I was home alone, doing homework at the kitchen table, when the cellar door slammed open. I froze, staring as a figure emerged from the stairwell. It was the same thing I'd seen in the hole, gray skin, black eyes, a twisted grin, but now it was taller, its limbs impossibly long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It looked at me and said, "Help me." I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's yard. They called my parents, who came home and found the house in disarray. Furniture overturned, claw marks on the walls, the cellar door ripped off its hinges. We moved out the next day. The house still stands, empty and decaying. The locals say it's haunted, but they don't know the half of it. Sometimes, when I drive by, I swear I can hear the sound of digging. And on stormy nights, I still hear the voice in my dreams, "Help me."
Story number 9.
I was 22 when I got my first apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom in an old building on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was quiet, so I figured it was perfect for someone starting out. I didn't mind the creaky floors or the occasional flicker of the lights. It added character, or so I told myself. The apartment had one quirk, though, that unsettled me. A door in the hallway closet that led to what the landlord called a crawl space. When I asked about it, he waved me off, saying it was sealed off and used to run old pipes that were no longer in use. I didn't give it much thought at the time. It stayed locked, and I figured as long as nothing weird came out of it, it wasn't my problem. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking and binge-watching TV shows, trying to make the place feel like home. But by the end of the first week, things started to change. It was subtle at first. I'd come home from work to find small things out of place. A chair pulled away from the table, the blinds slightly open when I knew I'd closed them. I blamed it on my own forgetfulness. Moving was stressful after all. Then came the noises. It started with faint scratching sounds at night, like mice in the walls. I told myself it was an old building and rodents were a common problem. But the scratching grew louder, more deliberate, and it wasn't just confined to the walls. Sometimes it seemed to come from the closet, the one with the crawlspace door. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a distinct tapping sound. It was slow, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from the closet. I froze, my heart pounding. "It's just the pipes," I whispered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The next morning, I decided to check the closet. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see some kind of animal or maybe just old plumbing causing the noise. But the closet was empty, save for a few boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. The crawlspace door, however, was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. The landlord had told me it was sealed. I reached out and pushed it shut, hearing the latch click back into place. "It's nothing," I told myself, "probably just shifted open somehow." That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that I wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, moving slowly through the apartment. I held my breath, listening as they stopped outside my bedroom door. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an intruder? A neighbor? I reached for my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could dial, the footsteps moved away, fading toward the closet. The next day, I called the landlord. He assured me no one had access to the crawl space and insisted there was no way for anyone to get inside from there. "Old buildings make noise," he said dismissively. "You're probably just hearing the pipes." I didn't believe him, but I didn't know what else to do. I bought a heavy-duty lock for the closet door and tried to convince myself it was enough. It wasn't. The following night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint but steady, like someone standing just outside my bedroom door. I turned on my bedside lamp, heart hammering in my chest. The breathing stopped. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept toward the door. My apartment was small, and it didn't take long to check the living room, kitchen, and bathroom. Everything was quiet. But when I opened the closet door, I felt the air grow colder. The crawlspace door was open again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep grooves carved into the wood. They were too large to be from an animal and too deliberate to be accidental. My stomach churned as I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I barely slept that night. The final straw came a few nights later. I had just gotten home from work and was heating up leftovers when I heard a loud thud from the closet. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been thrown against the door. I grabbed the bat and approached cautiously, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Summoning what little courage I had, I opened the closet door. The crawlspace door was wide open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The air that wafted out was damp and smelled of decay. And then I saw it. A figure crouched just inside the crawlspace, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were black pits, reflecting the faint light from my flashlight. It grinned at me, its mouth filled with too many teeth. "Why didn't you let me out sooner?" It rasped, its voice low and guttural. I screamed and slammed the closet door shut, shoving a chair under the handle. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my phone in hand as I called the police. They arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the apartment, the crawl space was empty. The officer who inspected it said it was just an old, unused area and suggested I might have imagined the whole thing. I moved out the next day. A month later, I drove by the apartment building out of morbid curiosity. It was empty now, the windows boarded up. I later learned the building had been condemned after multiple tenants reported similar experiences. Noises, shadows, and that same unsettling figure in the crawlspace. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear it whispering, "Why didn't you let me out?"